Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined today by Michael Shepard. Michael is an adjunct professor of intercultural studies and political science at Hope International University in Fullerton, California. He did his graduate studies in community development and nonprofit management at Hope, and then intercultural studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. His background is in nonprofit management and community organizing, but now he's a stay-at-home dad, which gives him some time to focus on his research and writing about church and culture. He's also a dad like me, desperate for adult interaction, which you'll hear a little bit throughout our conversation. So welcome to the show, Michael.
Hi, how's it going?
Hey, and for our listeners, as we're recording this, Michael, I've been holding this. Yesterday was your birthday, right?
It was my birthday.
Yeah, so happy
Well,
birthday.
I guess it depends on when you post this. When we are recording it, it is my birthday.
Yes, as we're recording that, his birthday was yesterday. So this will probably air 3 months, we'll see, down the road. So Michael, if you get a bunch of like random birthday celebration notifications,
That's
is
fine.
why.
You can send cash. My address is
Yeah, you can. We'll drop the Venmo or whatever in the show notes. All right, let's get back to it. Tell our listeners what else you'd like them to know about yourself.
Yeah, well, glad to be here, and thank you for having me on. I've been listening since you started, and excited to think about the future of the church and ways that we can be more intentional about moving into that. My role at Hope has been exciting. I get to work with our international programs and students who are trying to connect in the community, and we get to have a lot of conversations like this. And I know that I've forwarded your podcast, and I've linked your guests over to our faculty and our students, and always happy to talk about what's possible.
Yeah, appreciate that. Talk a little bit about your story of faith, what that looks like today, and what it looked like in your youth, how you came to Christ, I guess.
Well, that's always an exciting question.
Yeah.
I grew up in a family that was around ministry, and I was telling someone the other day that my dad was a bit of a mad scientist of a Sunday school teacher, and like a lot of teenage Christians, I got really into apologetics.
Yeah.
And my dad saw that happening, and he assigned me Marcus Borg's Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time.
Oh yeah.
To kind of kick my butt and get me to stop being so apologetics driven. And he's a mad scientist, I say, because we went on from there. We read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship, and then Brennan Manning's Ragamuffin Gospel. So that was what I would have been like 16, 17 with that. And all of that kind of put in my mind a sense of call to the church and ministry. And I had met alumni from Hope, and I was excited about what they were doing, innovating in ministry and doing some neat things. So I moved from very rural Oregon to Orange County, California, which was a bit of a culture shock. We'll talk about that later probably, but met up with great faculty, great students that I was able to be with, who were thinking about how we can do ministry differently and how to live our faith in ways that really bring us life, not just doing the things that we had always done. And that has kind of taken me twists and turns. Thought that I would be doing missions work. But when we graduated, my spouse and I, we both got jobs working at non-Christian nonprofits in Orange County, which is not where we thought we would be. But that took us into just a different context for living our faith in ways that weren't church-based, and being introduced to wider ways to understand who we are and how we live faithfully.
Awesome. Now, Michael, when you say, I'm guessing we're similar in age here. When you say like getting into apologetics, like I think of like Josh McDowell, Evidence to Demand a Verdict.
Yeah, I read that.
Apologetics,
Case for Christ.
Case for Christ. Yeah.
And I just remember like that I had there was such a desire for there to be like this rational proof for
Mm-hmm.
Christianity that I'm glad that I was inoculated from
Mm-hmm.
that. So I teach world religions now, and whenever I meet folks who are in that stage of how do you prove Christianity or how you disprove someone else's religion, they find out I teach world religions. And they want to like, we had someone over at our house at a party one time, and he was asking me like, what do I say to people who are Hindu to prove that Christianity is true? Like, what is the one sentence that is like mic drop moment, walk away, and they're going to convert? And is like, it just kind of reminded me like how far off like interfaith encounter is versus this idea that we've had about Christianity that you can prove it true somehow, and that you can prove it true in a laboratory or on the page, and that's going to produce results when like, faith that is healthy, Christianity that is healthy, has to be lived out, and it always will be ambiguous. But there's so much more freedom in that. There's so much more freedom in not having to have a faith that relies on this perfect logical argument or constructing the straw man's exactly to to always win.
Your dad really did kick your butt when he gave you Marcus Borg.
He did. I think that he like I don't know how much of it was like punishment payback for having a teenage son and how much of it was just his nerdiness about like finally someone I can talk to. But no, it was, I mean, he's always been someone who has taken an inclusive look at faith, and so it's a great model for like what ministry looks like without having to be right, or without having to be without having to hold power, or without having to hold intellectual power over someone else. And that's what I see a lot of apologetics now, is trying to create and hold intellectual power over someone else. And that's just there's a lot that we're going to talk about tonight, talking about lots of things. So I'll come back.
Come back to that if we have time. I'm writing that down. We'll talk about a spiritual practice that's been meaningful for you or you might recommend to others.
Yeah. Well, the main thing that we've talked about, and what we're going to be talking about today, is contextualization. And a lot of that I picked up while I was at Fuller, while I was studying world Christianity. And a spiritual practice that has been really meaningful for me the last 10 years at least has been reading contextual theology and biblical studies from cultures that aren't my own, and appreciating the insight that people have who are reading scripture, who are thinking about theology in their own language and their own perspective. It gets me out of my echo chamber, and it gets me away from the privilege that I carry about how the Bible has always been presented, or how theology has always been presented. So that's the spiritual practice that I've developed, is really spending time with perspectives outside my own. Where that has turned up a notch lately has been reading other people, not just for insight, not just trying to take away what's good from them, or to claim that I have greater, like, I don't Columbus their insight, but thinking more about how does this move me to action. When I read something, when I read liberation theology from queer people in Africa, that should motivate me to concern, or that should motivate me to action, not just, oh, that's interesting, that's different. Like that there can be this like exoticism about non-Western perspectives, especially in some circles, if Western society has become so problematic to the church, they look to places like Africa, Asia, as the future, because the future is outside the West.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's the last decade or so, there's been a lot written about, like, it's the third world is going to save the North American church, and there's
Interesting.
just there is some truth to that, but there's also some latent colonialism built into that. Which, again, we can talk about this some other time. And I guess, and then what's exciting for me is there's this assumption that the global church is very conservative. That is something that I'm starting to dig into and appreciate more, is that being part of a inclusive, progressive church and denomination, how the world church is not this monolithic conservative block. We saw a bit of that in the United Methodist Church, and the similar thing is happening in the ACNA Church, that the Anglican Communion of North America. That they're trying to rely on an appeal to global conservative Christians as a way to boost a domestic North American conservative church.
Yeah.
And that's just and so that's part of what I'm getting into researching now, and what I want to be able to support churches that are exploring what it means to live authentically and value whole people, even if their religious culture isn't as supportive of that.
We don't have time to talk about this, but I just saw this today on Twitter, Michael. There's this newly forming Methodist, like Global Methodist or something. I don't know if you saw that. So I'm guessing it's kind of fitting into that that trend you're talking about. But let's talk about contextualization, and tell me more about kind of how you got into that and what that looks like.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it had to do with just trying to understand my own experience. I moved from a very rural part of Oregon to Orange County, and that was culture shock. To give you an idea of that, my church back home was a converted stable, and and so I went from going to church in a barn to working at a mega church with a brand new multi-million-dollar campus in Anaheim Hills. So that took some getting used to. I wish that I had better self-awareness at the time, because I did things that I didn't realize that how much that change would affect me. But we talk so much about, like, if people move overseas, or if people move from an international setting to the U.S., like what is their adjustment period? And I did not have one. So that was back then, and a few other experiences like that. And then when I was at Fuller, I was studying world Christianity and getting more of the theory behind what works, and what works well and what doesn't, not just in an American setting, but around the world.
All right, Michael. So when you talk about contextualization, what does that look like in an American setting?
It's in all of the ways that we translate to be better understood by culture, or the culture of the people we're trying to connect with. And as culture is always evolving, churches are adapting to that as well. And there are some churches that resist doing this, some that do it in unhealthy ways. But the hope is that we can be intentional about adaptations, so that we are engaging people in ways that make sense. A big way that we've seen that just in this last year has been how churches have adapted to virtual space. That it's something that some churches did before 2020, but everyone had to figure out how do we adjust, and that's an adjustment to the culture. It's a technology adjustment to the culture, and some people resist doing that. Some people do it in unhealthy ways, but the goal is that we're intentional and we adapt well. Let me give you another example. This is from some of my research, talking about contextualization. I was interviewing a pastor at a very large church
Mm-hmm.
here in our town, and talking about what is their community, how do they see themselves as part of the community, how
Mm-hmm.
do they connect with people, what's their thought process, and what really stuck out to me was he was very direct to say our target demographic are people who shop at the Brea Mall.
Oh,
So
yeah.
so
Yeah.
he said for our church, the people that were anyone who would shop at the Brea Mall, which was the mall that's 2 miles down the street from their church, anyone who
Mm-hmm.
shops there are the people who we're trying to reach. So
Yeah.
that geography is it's about a 10-15 mile radius around where their church is, and in his mind it kind of like makes regional sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're here in Orange County, they're not trying to have someone drive an hour, 2 hours from the other side of Los Angeles to come to their
Yeah.
church, to say who are the people who are here. And so it had a geographic sense, but the other components of that are thinking about economically who shops at the mall,
Yeah.
and who does the mall cater to? Who is the mall's
Yeah.
audience?
Yes.
And then so you take that this social set of people who would shop at the Brea
Mm-hmm.
Mall. That's become this church's demographic,
Yeah.
and then you think through how church is constructed. It makes sense along those lines. If you're walking on this church's campus, it looks exactly like the Brea Mall. If
Interesting.
you are dropping off your kids, it looks like where there's childcare from the mall. The way that you are, the parking, like they have a parking garage that looks, that is the same structure, and all of it's the positive intent in that is that you're trying to lower the barriers to people
Right. Right.
coming on campus, and if people are already familiar with going to
Yep.
a place in the community like the
Yep.
Brea Mall, it can lower some of that resistance.
Yep.
And you think, and so that becomes how you think about the space. It's air conditioned. There are refreshments. There's coffee. There's a food court. There's the communication, the banners. All of those things are to meet the cultural expectations of people for where they spend their time, where they connect, where they spend their money, that all of those things get wrapped up in how they talk about membership, how they talk about financial support, how they do
Yeah.
spiritual formation, and all that becomes parts of church.
Yeah.
And that looks very different than a church who doesn't have that same demographic. But it also means that there's people who might live right across the street from that church who would never feel welcome there because they don't shop at the Brea
Yeah.
Mall.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a shift in thinking about like who are we trying to reach. That I think a lot of churches think geographically, like we want to reach everyone,
Right.
and you try and reach everyone, but then you don't have the same sense of purpose and direction,
Mm-hmm.
or your sense of you design your church to be for the people who you already have, and not thinking about who else might be
Yeah. Yeah.
available. Who else is looking for a type of spiritual community that we can provide? Or when you do think about how to innovate for the church, I'll speak for myself and I'll say other white clergy church leaders. We design
Mm-hmm.
church to be interesting for our seminary friends.
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
But really, like those are some of the people who we have the closest relationships with, and some of the
Mm-hmm.
people who we have the most connection to and understanding of.
Yep.
It takes a lot of work to understand your community,
Yeah.
and it takes a lot of work to understand people who are not similar to you. And
Yeah.
and if Christian community has been something that's a big deal to people, that's a major part of formation. Being able to communicate to people who don't already have that is difficult. We build
Yeah.
churches for people like us, and that's that really is what trying to do contextualization well is trying
Mm-hmm.
to get at, is how do we understand other people for the purpose of having healthy spiritual community for them. or
Yeah.
sorry, not for them as if we're just performing this, but like, how do we have this healthy community together? When it's
Right.
really healthy, there's a community that forms together between these sides, and that's where the theory that's behind it has been interesting to dig into. There's
Let's unpack this a little, because there's a lot there you've talked about, and I want to give like a silly example that when I think about kind of the broader term you're thinking about of just trying to communicating what you're so enmeshed with to outsiders. I remember probably a year out of college, I went to work at a 24-hour fitness as like a sales guy.
Yeah.
And we were trying to sell memberships. So every day people would come in and I try to give them a pitch about why they should plunk down $125 to buy a membership. And I remember like one day, like, the membership was like $50 off or $75 off. I'm like, this is such a good deal. How can people turn it down? And then I remembered, like, wait a minute, to them, like, $75 off means nothing because it's the $50 they're still gonna have to pay that they didn't have to pay yesterday.
Yeah, that's the sales trick in it, is that
Right.
and all of that. But we see that in in trying to find ways to connect, find ways to appeal to people, and frankly, like we're competing for people's attention, and that's where if an invitation to Christian community requires someone to do more work to even begin to start to form a relationship, there can be unnecessary barriers to that, and that's where something like you bring up fitness centers. If you think about CrossFit gyms is a big way to think about this. There's people who will go into industrial sections of a city that they've never been in. They will follow a sign into a back alley.
Yeah. What a great example.
In order to do punishing physical activities.
Yeah.
That's but think about how much
barriers.
People have to, how many barriers there are to get to the point of but people find a community there, and when you find a community there, then you're trying to pull people into it. It's like that. I mean, that CrossFit might be one side of that equation. The other side would be like a franchise gym whose name is well known. I don't want to get you in trouble with like naming, having to pay for royalties, but who would want to put their gym at major cross streets, have big windows, big signs
in the Brea Mall.
And we can do kind of a comparison to think about churches. Like, are there churches that their community, the power of community is so strong that you will cross all those barriers? We like to think that we have a strong community like that, or do you try and have a bigger front door so that people can find it? And that's, there are all sorts of other unhealthy things that can happen in that dynamic, but
it's really complicated. And when I'm thinking about Orange County, and for those who have any kind of connection to evangelical church in the last 30 years, the name Rick Warren Saddleback comes to mind, and the idea of the homogenous unit principle, which I think, did it originate with him or what?
Oh, well, I'll tell you the story.
Yeah, tell me the story. Tell our listeners the story.
So the homogenous unit principle is this idea that people like to be with people who are like them. That we generally gravitate towards people who are like us, and that was applied into church growth by a missiologist named Donald McGavran. And Donald McGavran actually was a disciple. He was part of the Disciples of Christ. And he was at Northwest Christian College, which is now Bushnell University in Eugene, Oregon. He had worked out this homogeneous unit principle while he was a missionary and church leader in India. And the main focus for him while he was in India was, how do we develop these churches that make sense for Indian Christians to be a part of? Indian Christians shouldn't have to learn English and pretend to be English in order to go to church.
Yeah.
And the theory was that when you had these churches that made sense in their local context, that it would lead to these natural, he called them people group movements. You would have you would have large conversion events. It was mainly talked about conversion in that setting, but really it was talking about like how do we develop a healthy church that's appropriate for that space, and the main part of it had to do with this assumption that people should not have to change their culture to convert to Christ. People should not have to change who they are to belong to a Christian community.
Yeah.
And so he was in Eugene with that. And then he was invited down to Fuller Theological Seminary to start the School of Church Growth. And while he was there at Fuller, got connected with a lot more evangelical ideas, I guess. But he was always a part of he stayed part of the disciples. And there's a lot that we can see in our tradition that's meaningful, that kind of like that were the seeds for some of that, which is part of what excites me in trying to like take some of these good ideas and bring them back to inclusive, progressive churches. Because I mean, we would say things too, like, well, people shouldn't have to change who they are to be part of Christian community. That's a good thing. But where this, I mean, you mentioned Rick Warren before, and where this, where this kind of came together, in 1993, Rick Warren finished his doctorate of ministry at Fuller. And he had applied this homogenous unit principle, or he looking at this homogenous unit principle in the context of Saddleback Church. So the title of his dissertation was "New Churches for a New Generation: Church Planting to Reach Baby Boomers." And so he took this church growth theory and applied it specifically to how do I reach baby boomers, and even more than that, baby boomer men who are living in the suburbs of Orange County. I
gotta butt in here and say, I don't know if I still have the book on my shelf, but good old Saddleback Sam, right?
Well, and then from that, I mean, where he like the popularized with the purpose-driven church, that thinking was spread to a lot of churches as this is the way to do church. That wasn't his intention. That people should take this and just replicate it, but it was to take that idea of understanding who you are as a religious community and who you're trying to reach, and make those connections. I think that there was in that era, there were a lot of people who just tried to copy it. But if you're not in the same context, if you're not in suburban Orange County with a housing boom, you're not going to have that same result. But we do see similar results when people do similar things. If you're planting an evangelical church in a suburb that's building houses for white people, you're going to become a mega church. That's that's not a scientific study, but it's true. But there's something that Don McGavran says about that too. Even as he's talking about some of the early writing about this church growth theory, he cautions people about taking it too seriously. Because he says that even with all of the best theory, there are churches that should not grow that do, and there's churches that do grow that really should not. So it's kind of I take that as kind of some foreshadowing of how we get into some of the problems of not just churches that are too big, but churches that are not a fit for their community, or internalizing some of the cultural patterns that they shouldn't. Like with this Brea Mall thinking, that can get you to thinking that our spiritual formation is really transactional and consumeristic. And you miss people who are not economically viable church members. Or your church leadership excludes people because they're not economically viable, and that's so it's not about how we contextualize. It's what things do we incorporate into our religious community that we shouldn't. We generally call this syncretism.
Yeah.
That might be a term that people are familiar with. That has some
I mean, generally it's used in like
other connotations.
world religion studies, right?
Yeah.
The idea of blending world religions, but your point is blending cultures a little bit, yes?
Yeah, I mean,
cultural elements.
It can happen both ways because religion is such a big part of culture that it's hard to incorporate religion without incorporating culture because it has to live somewhere. But syncretism would be a way that we might be used to thinking of this unhealthy type of contextualization.
Oh, okay.
And then we can apply that back to us of saying, our marketing culture of the U.S. that is a syncretism that the evangelical church has with our American culture. Fair. But when we've held syncretism as this is what those people do over there, we don't apply that back to ourselves.
Yeah.
And you could apply that same type of thinking to. I'll dunk on evangelicals all day long if that will boost your viewer count. But it's something that we have to be aware of in inclusive progressive churches too. That what are cultural elements that we absorb unintentionally.
Yeah.
There's a lot of whiteness that we've absorbed unintentionally that we've maintained intentionally. There's a lot of rainbow washing that we do of our churches, that a lot of greenwashing, a lot of performative token participation. So there's still a lot of work and those are things those are things that happen in the culture at large. So we don't always see when we're doing those same things. We think that we're doing better, but that's a pretty low bar for us. To clear.
Well, let's get into some specifics here about kind of like what are some, I mean, we've kind of talked around it, like pros and cons. Like, can you provide more like specific examples? Like, obviously a pro would be like, hey, applying the homogeneous unit principle, you might be able to really target a demographic in your community to reach. A negative would be you're excluding by principle, you're excluding someone else potentially in your community. So talk to more about some of those pros and cons.
Yeah.
And then maybe like, where does this get off the rails?
Well, I think a beneficial part of it is being more intentional about the desire to invite people to healthy Christian community. And that is, I think, part of what we have in our progressive Christian spaces is we assume that people already know that they're welcome. We assume that people already know that they're invited, and
they don't know it.
Yeah, and it's something that people who are already familiar and feel safe in a church, they don't realize the distance between where they are and where someone else might be. So so thinking along these lines helps you to see what you're missing. It helps you to think about the barriers that you have. We had this when we started going to our church. We had 2 young kids, and there was one other mother with a young child who was part of the church. There were a lot of people who were empty nesters, and they loved kids. They loved having kids in church. They just hadn't had kids in church for such a long time. And the one mother and daughter who were there were so tightly knit in that community that it was like having aunts and uncles and grandparents, everyone there. But being able to think about what are the barriers to a young family starting to come to our church, that they would kind of fall back on, like, well, we used to do this in the 70s. Well, what a parent is looking for in 2021 is not what parents were looking at in 1970. So it took some intentionality to unlock that desire from people in the congregation to, like, you say that you really want us to be here, but we don't know until you show us.
Yeah.
And like our kids are loud, and I mean we're loud, so and we were stubborn enough to stay there as we dealt with some of that.
Mm-hmm.
If we were also carrying some religious trauma, if we were also carrying some hesitation
Yeah.
about being in church space at
Yeah.
all, it would be so much
Yeah.
easier to just say, like, you know what, like this
See ya.
just and I mean rightfully so, to be like, it's not safe for our kids. We don't know if they're
Right.
going to be a part of this here. So that would be part of, like, if the people that you are trying to connect with are people who would have young kids,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that you need to be mindful of. How do we connect with this? And I mean, there can be so many examples from megachurches, because I'm in megachurch central here, but there's a church next door, in the next town over. Their whole children's department was designed by contractors for Disney.
Wow.
And so,
Wow.
because part of their thinking is, if kids are excited to come to church, if kids are asking their parents to go to church, then the parents are going to come. And there's this myth that if a father becomes a part of the church, that the likelihood of the rest of their family coming to church, it's very heteronormative, and it's very nuclear family centric, and it's statistically garbage. But
oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, like, gets passed around, and enough people start to believe it. If that were true, then we would have more men in church than women.
So the idea is, just so I'm clear and our listeners are clear, is that the idea is that we think of, like, the mom, again, to use our nuclear family analogy, we think that the mom is usually the driver for church. And this idea that you're saying is bunk is that if we can get the dad to want to be a part of the church, then
yeah, this is the bunk. And if your readers, if your listeners want to read a book, it digs into some of this masculinity crisis that the evangelical church is trying to remedy. And it's this idea that churches are that mainline churches especially, they are too feminine, and that's the reason why men don't go to church. And so churches following following their homogenous union principle, this thinking is, if we can get men to come to church, and men are the spiritual leaders of their family, then the rest of the family is going to come. So how do we get the husband to interested in church, coming to church, and you can do all, and then you do lots to make the husband feel comfortable in church, to the neglect of non-husbands. You're not going to teach about mutual submission and how a man needs to be taking care of his wife, and making sure that she is fully affirmed and healthy in marriage. You're going to fall back on some of these complementarian ideas and male headship, because those are things that feel good to people who are looking for that.
Yeah, there's a big church, I won't say its name, in my part of the world, and it's obvious they are male-centered, like white, straight, male. That is their demographic they're going after. And I think it extends beyond just teaching, Michael, like ministry opportunities, like, where, like, the men can go out and do, like, I don't know, go to the range or something, like, really macho like that, and the women are like, hey, the women's ministry is like, let's sit around and have coffee.
Yeah. Women serve, and men get to have adventures and do the actual leadership. And I'd say that, and that's part of a contextualization as well. What does your leadership structure look like? And an all-male boardroom is trying to recreate a certain type of culture that people feel comfortable with, and that is changing. Even the way we talk about leadership, at our church we have an elder board. That's where else do you have an elder board? But is it effectively like talking about a board of directors for a nonprofit? Do we adapt to say we have a board of directors because that's something that makes sense to people who are not already
Yeah.
churchy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have and how do we invite people into leadership opportunities? Like
Right.
that we've sanctified committee structure and
Mm-hmm.
rules of order for
Yep.
for meetings, when that's a really foreign concept. And for people
Yeah.
to be successful in that environment, they have to learn a different language. They have to learn a different culture. And so that's part of how you could apply this homogeneous union principle as well. Is, are we requiring people to convert to our church culture in order to be a part of being here?
What a great way to turn it around. Yeah, that's a great principle.
And some cons to this, we've already talked about some of them. You might hyper focus on a demographic, and that leads you to do things that aren't healthy.
Mm-hmm.
You won't know who you're excluding, because it looks like you're meeting your goal. It looks like there's activity. There's people coming in. There's people who are finding meaningful spiritual community, but you don't see who's missing. Or when there is a problem, it's easy to just try and remove that person who's causing a problem and assume that someone else will be available who can meet their need. And it's a way to kind of I don't know, like you can focus so much on yourself and let other churches handle or carry water for you. That, like, I think about our own church, and there's probably a lot of progressive churches are like this. How many ex-evangelicals end up coming to church with us who have this religious trauma that now a major part of our ministry is healing trauma and being and I mean it's a blessing to be part of someone's journey in healing religious trauma,
but it's a lot of work.
And it's something that like, it would be better if the religious trauma just didn't happen. But but if we exist if in Christianity we exist in an ecosystem, and you have, forgive this analogy, but like if you have someone who's polluting the stream upriver and we're fishing downriver, that we're not in a situation to be responding in the best way that we can. And as much, and whenever we're critical of who's polluting the stream upriver, it comes across as divisive, or that we're bitter or jealous, when really we want, I want Saddleback or any of these other mega churches, I want them to be healthy spiritual communities. I want them to be I don't want them to be traumatizing people. Because they're able to do ministry in a way and connect with people in a way that that our church doesn't. Like, we can be different and still be connected in purpose. And that's and then we can see how this desire to connect with a specific group of people, it can lead you to some strategies for in recruiting and assimilation is the term for it. And I know a few people, like, their job title is pastor of assimilation. And it sounds like this sci-fi Borg concept.
But
it's something that I think about how much, like, it's a good idea, even if the word is wrong. Like, how do we help people see that they belong to this community? How do we help people connect with other people who are part of this church? So one of the things I'm working on with our church are just some of the materials to do that in a more intentional, streamlined way. Because we would tell people when they come to our church, well, if you really want to get involved, join a committee. That's
talk about homogeneous unit principle.
But to think about, like, how do we share who we are at the right speed for someone? And I think back to,
that's a great way to say it.
Thinking along the lines, like, if you were to join a nonprofit and you were volunteering for them, what kind of information would be helpful? You'd want to know about the mission and the history. You'd want to know about finance. You'd want to know who the leaders are and where you're supposed to be and what time. So like there is an expectation that people will communicate these things, and that we can communicate these things without scaring people off. But I think we get into some other issues as we start to drill down into these homogeneous unit principles. We might think about demographics, like shopping at the Brea Mall, but we have ways that we segment marketing already, like soccer moms, NASCAR dads. That was a big part of past elections. Churches can get granular into exactly who they're trying to reach in that regard. But something that we've started to see more take off is how churches are using data mining and algorithms to find people who are likely to look for religious community. And some of that can be, useful, but it also gets into some kind of shaky ethical ground. Like if you know that someone who is has been recently divorced is more likely to, a woman who's recently divorced is more likely to join your church, then are you trying to find metadata that looks like someone just got divorced for you to put an ad in their social media to say join our post-divorce care group? And I mean, on one hand, that's a very loving thing to do, to know, like, let's reach out to people who we know need us, but it can also be a very manipulative thing to do. And the more that you dig into some of that data, the ethical part is, are we preying on vulnerable people and trying to recruit them under these false terms? And are we trying to make our algorithm strategy look like the Spirit? Are we trying to use our algorithm algorithm strategy to make people think that God has led them here? And that's hard to, like, if you're not getting into this like missiological nuts and bolts, it's kind of hard to see. And if that's the system that you're in, that hey, we're using technology, we're using strategy, we're reaching the lost,
and it's the Spirit,
that everything works, and there can just be there's so much that can be dangerous in that. There's a lot that's come out. I shouldn't say there's a lot that's come out, because I don't want to assume that everyone knows things about this, but in regards to how in elections data has been used, how you have churches that might have their own app. There's questions about how that data gets used, how that data can get used, how that data can be sold and then used. There's some links to how data was used. Megachurch app user data was used to put political ads in front of church members, knowing that they would be more likely to vote for certain candidates.
Wow.
So it has to do with, like, how does this metadata get shared? Who does it belong to?
Yeah.
And if you're a part of a church, you might sign up for an app because you think, oh, like, this is a nice way to get a daily devotional every day. But do you read the terms and services? Do you know what the church is doing with your data?
No.
No
one does.
Is it tracking you? Does it know when? Is there someone at the church who is being able to check a box to say, oh, Michael has only been on campus 10 times this year. How do we get him on campus more?
I think they do, because I remember talking about a church app a couple years ago, and I think it had that kind of geo-targeting where it could kind of know if you're in, the geo-fence, and it would kind of give you alerts like, here's the daily bulletin or something.
Yeah.
So, well, we could talk about this all day, but for sake of time, let's take a break before. Let me ask you one more question before we take a break with this question. Like, all this stuff you talk about is kind of like the nightmare scenario of why progressives, Christians, don't want to think like this. I remember even in Bible college, like, we talked through these lists of, like, what made people more, I don't want to use the word susceptible, but it's kind of fair, of, like, a divorced woman, a death of a child, death of a parent, those kind of things. Even in Bible college, we talked about, like, what made them more, quote unquote, open to receiving the gospel. So for sake of these reasons, and not wanting to be icky or unethical or, whatever.
All of your listeners should know that we are good people. So whatever question you ask, just hear it in the context of Lauren is a good person.
Thank you, Michael. How can progressives use this kind of thinking in a way and still be ethical, responsible people?
Wow. I really wish that we could, but I don't know if that's possible.
Okay.
But part of that is knowing that this field of data mining and algorithm use is so new and so hidden that it's hard to find any examples of it being used positively, because it's used to drive capitalistic goals. It's used to put products in front of people to spend their money on. It's used to identify who is vulnerable for financial abuse. And so to think about, like, how is that something of the culture that needs to be redeemed? Is that something about culture that is possible to be redeemed? Can dehumanization and oppression be used for the church? And there might be some short-term gains, but it's hard to see how those things, unless they are radically, systematically demolished and then rebuilt, it's hard to see that being used in a healthy, affirming, liberating way. I think that there are some ideas that lead people to using that tool, like the homogeneous unit principle or other intentionality, other missional strategies that can be useful. But for that technology specifically, it's really hard to know that that's going to be something that can be a long-term benefit.
Yeah. Well, I hate to cut you off, but let's leave it there. Let's take a break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Michael Shepard, and Michael, I always tell people you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to, but if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do? What's your day like?
Well, this is an American-centric answer, and I assume that by Pope, you mean I just have authority over the universal church. So,
yes.
I would mandate.
You get to define it as you want to, really.
I would mandate that all churches willingly publish 990 financial forms. This is kind of a nerdy answer to like what I would do as a pope. There's a lot of more fun things, but it's a standard nonprofit financial disclosure that churches aren't required to do, but it would just bring so much to light about financial mishandling or bad governance.
So much.
Nonprofits do it already. Small nonprofits do it on a postcard. Large nonprofits who can afford to hire auditors to do it can do it. So it doesn't solve all the problems, but at least gets it out in the open.
This 100% agree. 100% agree. I remember I was on Twitter a while back, and I was like, someone was pushing for taxes or something for churches. I'm like, that's never going to happen. But the 990 should happen for churches. I mean, so much garbage financially happens in churches and just gets thrown under the rug because no one knows.
Yeah, and
we could spend all day on that.
That'll be something I'll come back to and talk about. 990s, but it's something. But it's also something. There are these abuses at huge megachurches. There's abuses at tiny churches down the street, but a 990 is a way to at least get that information to the public, and so people can make those decisions themselves.
A theological or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Oh, I had a couple of these, and mostly just people who are interesting to me in history, who I wish we knew more about. One of them, Sorgatani Beki, she was the daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan, and she was a Christian, and had a major push within the Mongol Empire of how do we bring Christianity to be part of our empire, and the popes at the time didn't think it was worth doing.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
got kind of stuck in geopolitical area there. Someone else, Michael the Deacon, he is an Ethiopian, part of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He met with Martin Luther as a way. Martin Luther, Michael the Deacon traveled to Germany, met with Martin Luther, basically to tell him like how the Ethiopian Church works and how the Ethiopian Church is healthy without Rome, and that kind of helped support Martin Luther with the Reformation.
Interesting.
That he left that meeting in full communion with Martin Luther, which was something that not many other theologians got to have, because Martin Luther didn't go into full communion.
Yeah.
And then the other group are Christians who were in the U.S., people who or Africans who were Christians who were brought to the U.S. and enslaved, who had Christianity before being enslaved. You had Congolese Christians, you had Catholic Christians who were brought to the U.S. and had a Christianity before their slaveholders introduced them to their Christianity. And we actually, there's some history about these Catholic Protestant conflicts within enslaved communities because they were bringing their religion already. And it's fascinating to me how, like, even in such an oppressive situation, you had a historic faith that was not based on white Protestant oppression. And so just that, that whole era is tragic, that we've lost that history and the ability for people to tell their history and be proud of that. But to know that there was, even in that oppression, there was this seed of a gospel that was authentically African, and that would have traced itself across the Atlantic, in the Congo, back to Ethiopia, back to Philip with the eunuch in Acts. That there's just that whole scenario just fascinates me, and I wish that we knew more about it, and I wish that that it would just be possible.
Well, I love these perspectives you're bringing. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think that it will be remembered as a time in which a private personal life ceased to be expected. I think that for many folks, religion is supposed to be private. And so I think that's going to, for our religious history, I think that will cause some problems. If we are not private people, we live online, we have our information available online, we share very personal things about us with strangers, and there's just more of a sense that you share your identity is meant to be lived out loud. It's not just something personal. But religion is one of those things that we treat like a personal, private thing. That we have to think about what that means for public space, and what that means in healthy ways. That people live their faith out loud in very destructive ways. We don't want to do that. And I think we see some of that in like with what William Barber's doing with the Poor People's Campaign, with Guthrie Grave Fitzsimmons, his book Just Faith, and the Religious Left. What does it look like to make our religious convictions, our religious life, affect our public policy in ways that aren't just replicating destructive patterns? We could spend a whole lot of time talking about that too.
All right, I'm going to spring this on you, question, Michael, because I've changed my question since I sent you these notes. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
Oh, I hope that we are able to become more comfortable, more familiar with new questions. And there's just so much about our theology right now that they're responding to questions from 200 years ago. And those questions are based on assumptions from 400 years ago. And as our world is changing so much, climate change creates new theological questions for us. And the more we understand about biology and neurobiology, the more we think about living beyond Earth. Those are theological questions that we can't just read the Bible and have the answer. So that's, I'm hopeful that we become a little better with thinking new questions, and not feeling like it's so that it's so extreme. I mean, like our question tonight, like, what should churches do with data mining? We're not going to open up the Bible and find the verse that tells us what to do with that.
I mean, you have to dig pretty deep to build a theological case for data mining, yay or nay.
So what I'm hopeful for is where I see people asking new questions and having the freedom to explore that in ways that that can lead us to new places.
That's great. Well, where can folks find out more about you?
I'm on Twitter. We'll probably link that some way in there, but it's at MCHL Shepherd, SHEPHERD. That's probably the best way, and I'll have a link there to my newsletter. I'm working on a few projects right now, and a book proposal about missiology of progressive Christianity. And so if that's something that people are interested in, I'd love to connect more and see where that takes us.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, Michael, and may God's peace be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Torn Curtain Arts in partnership with Resonate Media. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit futurechristian.com. If you've enjoyed the show and you think it would be valuable for others to hear, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. That really helps more people find us. Thanks again, and go in peace.